Thank you very much. So as Hiro mentioned, the talk has 4 parts, and they will be about first, how to measure perceptual awareness, and the relevance of this for the neural correlates of consciousness is, of course, that we need some kind of information on what the participants or patients are experiencing, and that's been part of my research has focused on this. How do we gain information on this the best way? The second part is about consciousness, whether it's an all or none phenomenon, and I'll get more into the relevance of that later. Then part 3 is about functional correlates of visual experience. That's what a large part of the field is studying right now. The fourth part is about these neuroarchitectural correlates of visual experience, and that's the direction that we've been going in for some years, and that's indeed what our new consortium is all about. So in that part and in the future direction, I'll talk a little bit about the consortium as well, but not so much. So in a consciousness club, I intend to spend very little time introducing consciousness. I will just say here that when I speak of it, I mean like a first order consciousness, so subjective experience or qualia. And so this could be the way that things appear to us, the painfulness of pain, so on, inner speech, voluntary actions, sense of control, these kinds of things, the subjective aspects of this, in contrast to the objective processing. And when I first started my PhD, a big part of the debate was how do we measure consciousness behavior? So on the one hand, we have people arguing that like the prime unit that we try to explain is people's reported experiences. But on the other hand, as scientists, we often prefer to have objective measures of something, and that's a bit harder to achieve in consciousness research. So there's been a couple of different objective, or at least to some extent, objective measures put forward. And the first, when I just started, was this post-decision wagering. So it essentially works by you having a participants complete some kind of task, often a visual identification task or something like that. And then instead of reporting their awareness, they place a wager on this. And that was supposed to get rid of the introspection component, which might be inaccurate. And it's supposed to be more intuitive and fun to do experiments, so you keep the participants motivated. But it hadn't actually been compared at that time. So we and another lab, so it's Salt and Venus and Seth, around the same time compared different scales using different paradigms. So I will talk a bit about our study on this. And it's a simple visual identification paradigm. So we presented a stimulus to the participants with from across varying durations. So sometimes it's very brief, you see nothing. Sometimes it's very clear, or you almost certainly see it. And sometimes it's in between. Then we mask it to get this degraded perception effect. And then participants reported their awareness. And they did this using one of 3 scales. And this could be either a perceptual awareness scale. So this is a scale that is indeed very subjective. Participants report their experience on a 4-point scale that is no experience, a weak glimpse, or brief glimpse, almost clear experience, or clear experience. We then had a corresponding consciousness, confidence rating, where people just say whether they're guessing or more confident, also 4 steps. And finally, this post-decision wagering scale. Nowadays, often people use signal detection-based measures or things like that to compare scales. Back in the days, we used what was called the guessing criterion, one of them, and zero correlation criterion, the other. And that simply means that if we want to check how valid or how exhaustive a scale is, we would expect performance to be relatively close to chance, if not at chance, when people say they see nothing or they claim to be guessing. Particularly if one scale does this, so that on one scale, people are chance when they use the lowest rating, but above chance on another scale, we would say that the first scale is probably more exhaustive. In the same way, if the correlation between awareness ratings and accuracy is better for one scale than another, we would say that that scale is likely the preferable one. So the plots here show average accuracy in the identification task down here, and then the accuracy for each of 4 ratings with the combined accuracy for each rating out here. And what we can see is that the awareness scale was the one with performance closest to chance, and it also had the best correlation. So what we concluded here was that in this particular study, the perceptual awareness scale performed the best, and wagering performed the worst. Other people have done similar studies. So we had around 36 participants, I think. And Michał Wierciun's lab in 2014 conducted a similar study with a different paradigm, but with 100 and something participants, and found something similar. And a few years ago, we did a patient study, so with patients with schizophrenia and healthy controls. And again, we found similar results. So as I mentioned, nowadays, people probably, or at least some, would prefer signal detection-based measures like meta-D prime. So that would be interesting to see how they compare using that. And indeed, very recently, a student of mine created a measure of meta-D prime within a statistical framework, so that you no longer have to calculate it for each participant separately and then do your statistics and use power that way. But instead, just can put everything into a statistical model. So that was one type of objective measure, wagering that we perform to subjective measures, but there are others. And in 2014, we compared perceptual awareness scale to one such measure, and this is the exclusion task. So the task itself is quite clever, I think. You present a prime, and you can mask it, so forward and backwards mask in our study, and then you present a word stem. So if it's what is called an inclusion task, you're supposed to write the prime, so you write mark it. And this way, you're both primed to do it, and your overt decision is also working in that direction. But if instead you do an exclusion task, you're supposed to write something else. So the correct answer could be March or Mars or anything that really starts with M-A-R as a word. So in this case, you have you're primed to write market, but you're overtly trying to write something else. So you have overt processing and unconscious processing working against each other. And then you can either look at it across different conditions or use both inclusion and exclusion tasks to estimate the proportion of unconscious processing. Now, our twist on the paradigm here was to add a perceptual awareness scale at the end. And the reason that we did this was that we wanted to examine when people exclude. So do they do it when they only report no awareness, or do they also do it when they report weak experiences? And if they do, that would suggest that the exclusion task is not completely exhaustive. And here are the results that we found. So at the bottom, you have the average exclusion performance for each stimulus duration. And at time 0, we're actually not presenting anything. So the 12% probability here is just that the computer and the participants select the same word to complete the word stem. What you can see quite nicely is that the match rate increases when you get to around peaks at 50 milliseconds. So at this point, participants are doing the opposite of what they're told to do. So they are writing the word more often than you would expect by chance. And then as it becomes more and more clear, the word, they start doing the task as they're supposed to and exclude it. And at 200 milliseconds, they're basically excluding every time. So they find some other word to write. Now, if we look at the same graph here, but split into awareness ratings, and this is 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can see that when people claim to have an almost clear experience or clear experience, it quickly drops below chance and stay there. But when people report no experience, that's where you have most of this unconscious priming effect or failure to exclude. But you also have it when people claim to have just a weak experience of the stimulus. So this to us suggests that this exclusion task is not entirely exhaustive, that there are indeed residual awareness in it. Now, my own conclusion on this is not that it is a bad task or useless in any way, but I tend to go to conclude similarly to Michael Snodgrass in 2002, where he says that exclusion tasks identify an important threshold, which is the willingness or ability to use information overtly, but they do not demonstrate unconscious perception. And I think this captures it quite well, that there are some weak experiences that are just maybe not diagnostic enough for you to exclude the word, but they still make you capable of performing a task, just not in the normal sense where we say that being capable of doing something means you can do it pretty much every time. So that was comparing two so-called objective measures of awareness to subjective measures, and I'll just and that showed in general that the subjective measures perform overall pretty good. At least there's no reason not to use them, but this was all based on vision. So one of the directions we've been moving in is to see if we can do something similar for motor research. And the special thing about the perceptual awareness scale is that it's not actually created by researchers, but instead my old supervisor, Morten Overgaard, asked participants to create a scale while they were viewing visual stimuli. So basically, they were presented with these simple geometric figures and then asked to create their own scale. So we wanted to do something similar for motor research, and that came out in 2015 by then PhD student Mia Dong. And she had participants create a similar scale for motor control task. And what she did was that she presented a target on a screen, and then participants had to move their cursor from the center fixation to the target, but she introduced different kinds of noise and different extents of noise on the cursor movement. And they had 2 seconds to do this. Sometimes it would be possible, sometimes not, and sometimes a lot harder than other times. At the end of each trial, they then rated their sense of control, and they had, I think it was something like 4 blocks of around 100 trials, and they're supposed to, during the experiment, create their own scale. It turned out that everybody had found the number of scale steps they wanted at the end of the first block, and then they simply either kept the scale as it was or modified the descriptions a little bit towards the end of the experiment. So, the research question here for us then was whether participants create similar scales and how well the ratings on these scales relate to task performance. And so when we first look at how many scale steps people prefer, there was some variance. So you can see that there's a logical natural minimum, which is 1 step, but there's no natural upper limit. Some people might prefer 100 steps. No one did, but it's theoretically possible. So you'd expect a log normal distribution, which is indeed what we found. And the mode of the distribution is 6, but you have some participants choosing fewer steps and some choosing more. So the exact number of steps, you would expect some variance, but when you then look at how people describe these scale steps, it's actually quite striking how similar the descriptions were. So we tried to convert all scales to 6-point scales, and then look at the words they use to describe the scales, each step. And what you can see is that, so we suggested they would start each scale with the label no control and end it at full control. So it's not so surprising that nearly everyone chose to do that. But what is more interesting is that these intermediate ratings, they chose very similar wording, and that wording fits extremely well with each scale step. So you can see when people called it almost full control, it was nearly always when they were rating 5 out of 6 in terms of subjective sense of control over the cursor. So if we then looked at the relationship between control, rating, and accuracy, we tried to group participants into the ones who used fewer than 6 steps, and more than 6 steps. So we got 3 different groups who had different preferences in the terms of number of scale steps. But when we then plotted log distance to target as a linear function of sense of control, we can see that they all follow the same function. So basically, the conclusion seemed to be here that although people may have a different preference in how many scale steps to use, they seem to describe their degree of control quite similarly and have a similar sense of control to accuracy in a relationship. So, summing up on the first part of the talk here, is that in our view, it's okay to use subjective measures to ask participants directly, because when we do compare them to the objective alternatives that are present, they definitely do not seem to perform worse. And these participant-generated scales also perform okay, and we can make them both for vision and motor tasks, and of course in the future they can be made for all kinds of other tasks. So I think that is, yes, the end of part 1, and it might make sense if there are any questions that I can try to answer them now.
Yeah, thank you. So does anyone have a question from maybe Zoom or maybe YouTube? Yeah, there's also kind of lag in YouTube, so maybe people can ask late. But so yeah, let me ask you the brief questions. So for the perceptual awareness task you guys done in 2014, basically what do you mean kind of threshold for the awareness, like correct awareness is like about like 100 milliseconds? Is that like
could you say that again, please?
So yeah, you show the like try to kind of match primary stimuli and what you put on like a market stimuli, for example, and then like first like up to 100 milliseconds, they kind of fail.
Yes, so they tend to write market more often.
Okay.
So by chance they would do it 12%, but they may be doing it 25% of the time.
But after 100 milliseconds,
they're generally pretty good at it.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. So that's the stressful part. And
in a sense, although still at 50 milliseconds, they probably report the correct word then 75% of the time or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Let me check YouTube and somewhere. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So yeah, I don't have any question from people, but I also have one more question. So when you, another question about the motor control one. So how do you like check the cursor and like a red dot are kind of collide? I mean, once they collide, then you are success, or you have to be somewhere nearby, or
so in this one we just compared it to the distance to the target that they ended up at, because if you reach the target, the distance is quite low, and then they typically used a 6, I think, for that. But it's more at the intermediate difficulties where they don't really reach it, that allow us to make this function.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So will you talk about this sense of control and the neural correlates of it later, or?
No, unfortunately. So Mia left science, so we have no one to follow up on that path. We even have a couple of more studies with the sense of control that we're still waiting to publish. But unfortunately, we don't have anyone to follow up on that and do the imaging aspects, even though it could be quite fun.
Yeah, I think this it's quite interesting task, and like the rating and also
we can see that it's the type of work that we do that kind of has a bigger impact outside our field. So when we usually work with perceptual awareness scale, it's almost always other awareness or consciousness scientists who are interested. When we do this motor control, it's often people working with robotics or brain-computer interface who are interested in these subjective experiences of control.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think.
So in that sense, it's it's interesting that we can branch out a little bit.
True. I think Ryota also would be interested in, because he got recently a grant about like BMI stuff. So maybe we can talk.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, like I a little bit extended. So, but yeah, please continue.
All right. Then let's see here. I will try to switch back here, and there we go. I hope.
Yeah, should be
fine.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the next part of the talk is about whether consciousness is a graded phenomenon, and that may seem like coming in from nowhere, but it's actually been part of the debate for a long time, because some of the key theories in the field, for example, global neuronal workspace theory, claim that consciousness is an all or none phenomenon, and for that reason we should be looking for all or none correlates of experience in the brain, and then interpret those studies accordingly. So part of what we've been doing is, well, first, this view, this all or none view, has been in the literature for quite a while. It's been going a little bit back and forth, but even in the 90s, you have it with some of the people using exclusion tasks. They write here that masked words were perceived without awareness, at least on some proportion of trials. So they're talking about that you either see them or not, but on some trials you do, some trials you don't. They don't talk about weak experiences or processes working together or against each other and so on. And as I mentioned, you have it with the stand your hand, where they are talking about all or non-invasive properties that distinguishes, I think in this case, is consciousness, conscious processes from other processes. So you have this view in the literature. And if you look at some of the evidence that has been given to show that consciousness is all or none, our claim is that it is not actually as strong as it appears. So these are some old papers, some of them, but the same claims were made again in the Stand Your Hands book, which is, I think, 5 years old or something like that. So the first piece of evidence is that in masking, for example, you have these steep psychometric functions. So that shows a kind of a transition. Here's the fractional of seen trial. So participants, when they report that they saw it or not, and they say because it rises steeply, it means that awareness is all or none. So we check this in our own data. So we have the 2011 paper where we plotted awareness and accuracy as functions of stimulus duration in the visual identification task I showed you just earlier. And what you see, so the black curves are the accuracy curves and the gray curves here, the awareness curves. What you see for all three scales is that the awareness function is actually more shallow than the accuracy function. From a signal detection perspective, that is actually what would be predicted, but I don't have time to show you the models of that. But just here, you see that it is indeed quite shallow, and we get so Bert Windy and colleagues got a similar result in their paper a couple of years later. So the conclusion is here that there's little or no evidence for the steep vertical psychometric function, but there's also other evidence, because a shallow slope can just be caused by a slow increase in ratings where participants say they are fully conscious. So it might be that they go from saying, no, I didn't see anything at all, and then suddenly, or rather gradually, they shift to seeing, I saw it completely clear. And when you look at this 2006 paper, that is indeed the pattern that you see. So here you have the distributions of ratings on a 21-point scale ranging from 0 to 100 and at different stimulus durations. So you have 33, 50, 66 milliseconds, and so on, going up to 150. Now, at 150, they're basically using only the top point of the scale. But if you go to the other stimulus durations, you can see that it's still top point and then also the lowest point. And once it gets harder, they use mostly the lowest point. So here it seems that yes, they have all or none experiences. And if you look at this 2004 paper by Claire Zhang, you see something similar for the attentional blink. That so you have it appearing at different strength, at different lags. And what you see is that people use mostly 0 subjective visibility and 100. And this has been presented as arguments that awareness is all or none. But when you use the perceptual awareness scale and indeed some other scales as well, in a masking experiment, you see a gradual increase. So this plot here shows the usage of scale points 1, 2, 3, and 4 by their proportionate rating. So you can see a gradual increase over here, and it's even there to some extent for other scales as well. Sorry, I'm getting a message about my internet. I hope I'm coming through clearly. All right, so, and if you then look at Claes-Jean's own paper, but for masking, you also have this gradual increase of awareness. So that raises the point, is it specific to the attentional blink? And the answer is probably no, because there was this later 2011 paper that showed that ratings in the attentional blink are graded when you use fewer scale steps than the 21 that they had here, or when you modify task difficulty a bit differently. So the conclusion is that participants report these intermediate experiences. Now the question that remains is whether they are meaningless. Could it be that they are just a chance for some point and then go to ceiling accuracy at a very sudden point in the scale? And when we look at the accuracy for each individual rating, this does not seem to be the case. We have different accuracy levels for each rating for all the scales that we've been looking at. So Sid Creeder and some colleagues published a paper called, I think, the partial awareness hypothesis in 2010, where they discuss this aspect and say that these intermediate accuracy levels for intermediate awareness ratings could be related to all or none perception of specific features or levels of representation. So an example could be, if we show you a geometric figure, you might, when you report having seen just a weak glimpse of it, you might just have seen an edge or a corner or something like that. And that is enough, for example, to, if you've only seen a line segment, to distinguish a circle from a square, but not a square from a triangle. So they're saying that maybe that is how it is graded, that you have all or none perception of different levels of representation. So we tried to get at this. I don't know if we're completely successful yet, but our first and best guess so far is by Simon Delpin, published in 2017. So he wanted to create a stimulus where you have to have all the parts before it's meaningfully there. And he figured that a kinesia triangle was such a figure, because in order to perceive a part of the triangle, the illusory triangle has to be there as a whole. And then he wanted also an objective measure of the influence of this triangle on perception. So he combined it with the Ponzo illusion. So the illusory triangle that you hopefully see here should make this top line here appear longer than the bottom line, whereas over here in the control stimulus with no triangle, they should appear to be of equal length. And then he, of course, modified the line, the physical line length here, and then compared participants, the probability of them saying that the longest line is the top line is the longest across these different conditions and across awareness ratings. And that's what we plot here. So these are this is the case where the lower line is physically longest, where they're the same length, and the upper line is longest. And we have the control and the illusion stimulus in each of these cases for awareness rating 1. And what we see is that at 1, they are just reporting a chance which one is longest, corresponding to not having any experience of anything. At rating 2, where they said they saw a weak glimpse of it, you start seeing this bias that they report the the top one to be the longest, even when it's not, and more so when they're the same length. And this bias then increases with awareness ratings, but it's already there for the second rating. So to us, this means that this perception of the illusory triangle has to be holistically graded. It's not about its fragments, because if it were about the fragments, it should really influence the other illusion, and you shouldn't really be able to see it anyway. So at least that was our best guess interpretation on this, but it's still something that we're thinking about if we can improve on. So for the summary of part 2 here, the perspective used to be that behavioral, that consciousness is all or none, but it's our view that the behavioral evidence for this is not strong. So I'm not sure we're ready to say that it is 100% certainly graded, but I think that's the best guess right now. That's the one I'm the most confident in. So that was part 2, and we can do questions here. If
So yeah, let me check the questions. Yeah, anyone from Zoom also can ask questions. Like,
Oh, it looks like these are just little breaks for me to have a sip of water.
Yeah. Please take a little bit. Yeah, I kind of confused the logic behind how you did the last experiment, like whether the conscious perception is more non-zero or more fading, gradual changes. Yeah, can you briefly explain again? Yeah, sorry. Okay. So y-axis is that length or?
The y-axis is the probability that the participant says the top line is the longest.
Right.
X-axis is the physical length.
Right. Physical length. So is there there's no physical differences there when they report PA as 1 lower is the longest and PA is 3? Okay.
No, they have the same 3 physical
right.
conditions. So in the center one, the lines are exactly the same length, for example. And then what we see is that as soon as awareness goes up, people say that the illusion one, that the top lines are the longest, even when they just had a brief glimpse of
right. Okay,
and this
okay.
effect increases with awareness.
Right. Okay.
So that here, even when the lowest is clearly the longest, when awareness is fully there, they say that like 70% of the time that the upper one was the longest. That's how they perceive it.
Okay. Right. Maybe I start getting understanding. So the actual judging probability is somehow correlated with the more illusion kind of, how I say, perceptual ratings.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That the clearer the triangle is, the bigger the illusion becomes.
Okay.
Which we're claiming that should only be the case if the perception of the triangle is graded as a whole, not that it's the small individual parts of it that you see.
Right.
Because you basically have to see all the parts to see the triangle to be able to create the illusion. You can't see just a line segment there because it doesn't exist. The line segment that should induce the illusion. It doesn't exist, so you only see it if you have if you see the triangle. Is the claim.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now it's clear to me. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. So anyone? We have like at least 12 speakers on YouTube, but yeah, people tended to.
We can continue. It's no problem for me if no questions or if the questions come later.
Yeah, usually come later.
I give people, I thought I'd give people an opportunity during each part, but it's fine if there are none.
Yeah, sure.
So
please.
Shall we move on to the imaging parts?
Right.
Then let's see here. And okay, there we go. So the third part is then our studies on functional correlates of conscious experience. And here the research question is tied up to the debate in the EEG-MEG literature, which is related to whether conscious experience is related to these late, relatively primarily prefrontal components, or some intermediate components that are either somewhat more global or more posterior cortical in their origin. And some of the original evidence, again, comes from the lab of Stanley Hen. It's a Kristian 2005 Nature Neuroscience paper. And the general claims in this paper have been made since then, as well, at least across the next 10 years after that. And I will just slowly take you through it because it's a kind of a big graph. So what they did is they showed the attentional blink, so where perception can be degraded. They asked people to rate their awareness on a 21-point scale, but they actually divided it into 4 categories to make it easier to analyze. So here it corresponded to unseen low scores. They call these unseen high scores, seen low scores, seen high scores. And their theoretical standpoint was that that there should be these all or none components. So you can then plot the different components in the EEG signal, ranging all the way from P1 at around 100 milliseconds to this late P3E at around 600 milliseconds. And what they then look at is the components. So let's see, for instance, the P3A, they say that there is nothing, and then something. And if indeed you plot the peak of the components, you see this all to nothing. And again, all to nothing. and here as well, all or nothing signal. So you have this rapid transition, and then they say that these are then the correlates of conscious experience in the EEG signal. But if you actually look at it, you have this N2 component, which is where you find in the EEG what some researchers, for example, Anti-Regonto and Coivisto, term visual awareness negativity. And it correlates with awareness in a graded sense. So when people say they have no experience, it's very weak. When they say they have some experience, a weak glimpse or something, it's a bit stronger. When they say they have almost clear experiences, it's even stronger again, and so on. And if you look at the ANOVA, even in this old paper claiming that consciousness is all or nothing, this very graded component that precedes all the all or none components is highly significant. So the F value is one of the largest here. So it's definitely present in their own data. The question that we've been asking ourselves then is, which of these components is the most predictive of experiences? And we've examined this in two ways. One is by contrasting one experience to another. And this we can do in bistable perception. So this is when you have a stimulus that you can perceive in two ways, but the physical stimulation is the same. So basically, you can control for physical stimulation and just have conscious experience alternating back and forth. And then you can look at the brain activity that alters with the experience. So in binocular rivalry, you achieve this effect by presenting one image to one eye, another very different image to the other eye in the same position in visual space. Then they can't be integrated and fused. So instead, the brain selects one and suppresses the other. This changes over time so that if you present it intermittently, like we did, so for less than a second, the two images, and then a short break, and then again, you get this effect that people perceive the same thing a number of times in a row, and then at some point it switches and you perceive the other thing. So a paradigm like this allows us to examine both the correlates of the experience itself and the reversals, activity related to modulation or spontaneous change in conscious experience, and the buildup of this stabilizing signal and the breakdown of it again towards a reversal. So we did this in a 2014 paper. We used a multiple sparse bias algorithm to reconstruct activity in the around 100 most active sources of the brain in the MEG signal. And then we used a canonical variance analysis to identify the time points for which the source activity differs the most as a function of all these things: perception, degree of stabilization, reversal, so on. And then we used a multivariate Bayesian approach to identify the most predictive sources of all these aspects. So if you look at the sources that were predictive of perception, so which of the two things people reported seeing on each trial, it's these occipital and temporal area sources in this time window that was exactly around the N2 reported in the Dehaene paper, but also reported in all these visual awareness negativity papers. If you look at reversals, it's somewhat similar, but instead of having the early occipital sources in there as well, you have parietal, probably attentional sources. So you have like late stage sensory plus attentional initiating the reversals. And then when you look at the buildup of the signal across a series of perceiving the same thing, and again, how it degrades when you move towards a reversal, it's again quite similar sources. You get a bit more, but still not so much frontal. And it's these occipital temporal sources, but perhaps over a longer time range. than before. So overall, in the MEG for this paradigm, it's mostly this intermediate time point correlate that shows anything about experience. But in a different paper, we also wanted to see if we can decode perception at these sources. So based on the MEG signal, how accurate are we when we want to guess what a person is seeing at any given moment? And this is from the 2013 paper. And what we did again was we construct activity in source space. Then we train support vector machines. So basically every 3 or 5 milliseconds or something like that after the stimuli come on. And then at some point, you can see the accuracy increases. So all of a sudden the MEG signal shows us with some accuracy what people are perceiving. If we use all sources, that's the signal of the black curve. If we look at only occipital or face-specific sources, so these are mostly temporal lobe sources. I think there might be one occipital like OFA or something in there as well. What we see for those is that we're almost as accurate using these as when we just use all the sources we have. But if we move to frontal, parietal, and motor sources, we're not very accurate at all. So this, again, shows that for this particular paradigm, we can predict experiences from the MEG signal in these posterior parts of the cortex. So we did a follow-up on this just because we wanted to see how constant this signal was over time. So we retested participants 2.5 years later. And what you have, so then we trained a classifier, again, support vector machine on data from this session here at time 0. And then we try to predict experiences either within this session or training it on this data and predicting on data from a session that was 3 days earlier, around that, or one that was 2.5 years earlier. And what you see over here is the gray is just on same session data. And then the black one is, you can see a slight drop, and that's when you try to generalize across days. So it's very small. But interestingly, when you try to generalize across years, you actually get the same small drop. So essentially, you are as accurate decoding experience across a couple of days as you are across a couple of years. So this shows us that this awareness-related signal is quite stable. Now, we wanted to see if it also generalizes to other types of stimuli. So what we've done so far is just binocular rivalry on these faces and gradings. But a PhD student, Maria Hernandez Lorca, 2019, did this study with us where we used stimuli with emotion content. So for negative stimuli, for example, spiders and snakes, and positives were puppies or kittens. So here you have something where the rivalry is between things with emotional content. So we want to see if we get, if it's similar component that predict experience, because it might be with more emotional content that the timing of this component changes completely, or that the location does. So our idea has always been that what relates to conscious experience is the area where the processing of that stimulus takes place. So we'd expect that for stimulus with emotion content, that it should be in areas related to that. Whereas the timing was a little bit less clear what we would expect there, other than, again, it should be whenever that relevant timing occurs in that area. So she did a temporal and spatial principal component analysis for the early to separate first the components in the EEG signal. So here is the EEG signal across all electrodes, and here are the components that are generated. Now you can see this one here is right around the time of the VAN in other studies. Potentially also these are at earlier points. And these here are more around the P3A and maybe P3B components. So looking at the results, the earliest significantly modulated component was indeed this one here, 280 milliseconds. So the N2 or P2, which is the same as indicated in the hand study, the one that varied gradually. Now the other components are also significant here. So this study is not conclusive in one theory versus another, but mainly shows that even for stimuli with emotion content, you have this early component. And when we try to localize it, it localizes to precuneus, which is quite interesting because that has been related to disambiguating emotional content in images. So, which really seemed to be the relevant process going on. So, but these stimuli were all one experience versus another. And I do know that many proponents of either global neuronal workspace or higher order thought, higher order theories in general don't really like that paradigm so much, because participants are always conscious of something, and what they're interested in or what they think should vary the most is when people perceive something versus when they do not, so that when there's a conscious experience present versus not. So this we examined in a 2016 study in cerebral cortex. This is Laura Müller-Andersen, the PhD student at the time, who conducted this study. So he used a simple visual identification task, present one of two stimuli here, so a rotated square. Well, technically it was rectangle because never mind. And masked it, and then participants have to identify it and rate their awareness. And what he then did was reconstruct activity in source space across the entire cortical mesh, and then divide this mesh into 4 lobes, and then see how accurate you could decode the awareness ratings based on source of origin and point in time. And this graph is a little bit messy, so I will go through it. So each of these subplots here denote the type of decoding. So here he's decoding no experiences, so pass rating 1, to weak glimpses, pass rating 2, and he does that either using all sources or only frontal, occipital, parietal, and temporal sources. And what you can see for this is that the biggest, the highest accuracy is for occipital sources. Now, when you decode weak glimpses, distinguish them from almost clear experiences, this is then the pass rating 2 versus 3. You get, again, similar results, quite high decoding from occipital sources, but also others. And for the final, almost clear to clear experiences, it's the same result. Now, so basically, when we test these statistically against each other, the occipital sources are the ones that generally say the most. And these simple visual shapes are, of course, processed mostly in the occipital lobe. So to us, that makes sense that this is where you have the clearest signal of having seen or not seen these images. We also then try to decode across different time points, so in this VAN time range, and against the later P3A time range. And you can see that there's a tendency for the earlier time window to be better, but that's not actually statistically significant. So in this paper, again, it just shows that the signal can be decoded already at this relatively early time point, and later time windows do not really add any information to that. But later time windows can definitely still predict it. But in terms of sources, we're still in the posterior cortex, not in the frontal. So the conclusion here is that the content and gradedness of consciousness appears closely related to posterior sources, specifically sources responsible for processing the stimuli, and that we can distinguish multiple and at least two of these peaks. Now, I just want to add to the previous thing I said, that I'm fully aware that this debate is not resolved yet, that there are still people arguing quite well for the role of the frontal cortex. And I think my own view here is that it's decided. I think the evidence is stronger for the posterior view, but and mostly that the evidence presented to support the frontal view originally was not as strong as it appeared. But what the truth ends up being, I don't really know yet. But then in terms of these multiple band peaks, this is some of the things we're pursuing at the moment. So in this 2016 paper with Michael Pitts and Stefan Fressler in this brief Nature Neuroscience one-page commentary thing, part of the questions we are asking there is which parts of this VAN are related directly to experience. And following up on that, it's been surprising to us that in some experiments we do, it seems like the earlier time window is closer related to experience, and some it's maybe the later time window. So we've been examining that in a paper by former shared PhD student, Hao Zhou, came out this year in Neuroimage. And what he was doing was he used this illusion called the temporal context effect. And it's an illusion where a short, briefly presented flash, so he had 50 milliseconds, how that appears either dimmer or brighter depending on the context of a long stimulus that lasts 230 milliseconds. So if you start the two flashes at the same time, the short one appears dimmer. But if you end the stimuli at the same time, so present the short flash, at the end it appears brighter than the long flash. So we can then compare through some sneaky tricks. We compare the activity of this flash to this flash. And so that is indeed, so the physical stimulation is the same, but one is, as an illusion, brighter than the other. And here we found that it's basically mostly the late part of the time window that predicts experience, whereas if you just physically ramp up the luminance of the stimulus, you of course also get an experience difference, but it's more in the earlier time window. So right now we're thinking that it might be related to how much experience is determined by bottom-up processes, or more, not necessarily more top-down in one sense processes, but also just like network processes going on at a later stage. Yeah, so that is our view right now, and I think it's good time to see if we have any questions to this part.
Right. Yeah. Anyone from Zoom can ask questions, and also people from YouTube can post any question on Slido. But yeah, always says buffer, so maybe. Yeah, I have not maybe question, but like comments. But like, yeah, this is quite interesting. For actually, we recently, me and collaborators published a paper about like philosophers looking into the binocular library experience, and they kind of somehow categorized based on their experiences, and it's what papers seem to related to your I think paper, like a grading of binocular library, like you kind of segmentize the experience, like a more phase or more another experiences. So we are not aware of the your paper, so yeah, I definitely want to look at your papers. But how, are there a lot of people arguing that like doing similar experiment, like grading the binocular library experiences?
So in Aarhus, we just used 3 categories. So you're talking about like graded perception, like different clarities, right?
Right.
So we used just the 2, like clear phase, clear grading, or mixed. And in these analyses, we've just removed the mix. But it is indeed something that I've wanted to do myself, but never had the time to do these graded perception. So, yeah. But I don't know any papers. One of the problems I had was, well, when you do it in MEG or EEG, you often use relatively short presentation times to get this clear evoked response. But when you ask people to decide whether they perceived it clearly or not clearly, it takes a bit of the time to make that decision. So it was a bit of a challenge finding a paradigm that would allow people enough time to actually make a thorough decision on how clear it was, or in which way it was degraded, because different, sometimes you have like piecemeal rivalry where small pieces of the screen the image rival in different ways, but also sometimes you have like waves going through the image where you're sort of reporting depending on how far that wave had made it and so on.
Yeah, that's true. Interesting. Yeah, I'll check the another question. Somebody, maybe not. But yeah, I also have one more question. But so in the Fernandez Oruca papers, like 2019, the one signal captures like more positive sources, like positive emotional content, but it seems to me there's no like negative, like the signal capturing negative informations. Maybe is that true?
It's, I'll bring it up on screen.
I was wrong. Yeah.
And share. So basically this one, right?
Right.
Yeah, that is actually that the component is mostly distinguishing positive from anything else, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I'm not actually. So personally, I don't have a really good interpretation of it. I'd like to see what Maria says, because in some ways you would expect negative emotion to maybe induce stronger responses.
Right. That's what I saw too.
So, and I think this was similar to many of the other components as well. So and it's unlikely that it's image related, because the images that we use, there are many different images of these puppies and kittens and whatnot, and they are just at random points in the images, highly complex images.
Right.
So yeah,
true. Yeah.
so it's it's a little bit odd to me as well.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about like MEG, like a space. How you say, how much they can get the signal from the deeper brain. MEG is mainly for cortical activities, I guess.
Yeah, so this is EEG, and which makes
right.
it even worse. So so it can be quite tricky doing good source localization here.
Yeah, that's
so yes, it may indeed be that the negative responses, perhaps they are more distinguished in regions that we don't really pick up a clear signal from.
Yeah, that might be one choices. Yeah, thank you. It's much clearer now. Yeah, anyone can post. Yeah, I mean, you can finish up. I guess we already spent a lot of time, so thank you.
Yeah, yes. So then, yes. So now the final part is the part that is most related to the direction we're moving in now, primarily, which is this thing about neuroarchitectural correlates of conscious experience. And the question that comes first is, of course, why examine this? And indeed, most studies use functional imaging, so either task-specific MEG, EEG, or fMRI to examine it. But I always thought that like the capacity of to be conscious is something that's like a property of a brain, whether or not it's conscious or conscious of something specific right now. So it's always been a little bit like, if a clinician presents me with a brain, it would be nice to be able to answer, is this brain capable of consciousness, rather than is this brain conscious right now? So that's one reason. The other is that without examining like the hardware of the brain, we can only really build these functional models of consciousness. And when we want to generalize, for example, to other species, perhaps having that hardware understanding of consciousness and not exclusively this functional understanding will also make it easier for us to draw conclusions. The last is that it's vastly understudied, and I'll give an example from Structure for Motion, which is this type of stable perception paradigm. It's you should see this 2D image as a 3D rotating sphere. It can rotate in both directions, but that is your brain interpreting front and back of the sphere differently. So any alternations that you see are self-generated. So if we look at studies of this, so MRI studies of this phenomenon, we found 30. 24 of those are fMRI, and 23 of those are like event-related, so task-specific studies where you examine what is going on while people view this using old fMRI. But that's only a small fraction of what you can do with MRI. So if you just look at different sequence types, some of the common ones is like T1 weighted, diffusion weighted, or spectroscopy, so MR spectroscopy sequences. And this is just like a broad categorization. If you look at T1 weighted, from that alone, you can gain information about cortical thickness, cortical curvature, size. You can use BBM to gain information about gray matter volume, white matter volume, and so on, so tissue segmentation. But in contrast to the 24 fMRI studies that have been done, only 2 have used these methods. And the same for diffusion imaging. You can use diffusion to get like some standard DTI metrics that are supposed to tell you something about microstructure, but they can be a bit hard to interpret. You can also get DKIs or kurtosis metrics, and you can do tryptography. So a lot of these things have never even been done for this phenomenon. But the interesting thing is that you can actually combine many of these quite easily. So just scan the same thing and then do the behavior separately. And even combining them is quite rare. There are a couple of studies, out of which Ryota did the one, so Ryota Kanai, and I did the other. And I think that's basically the 2 that there are. So in this field, what you often look at is the spontaneous alterations of conscious experience, and then you correlate that with some kind of property of the brain. And the first studies here from 2010-11, where they found that this alternation rate was related to the anterior and posterior SPL. And then Anouk Lohm did a 2013 study with spectroscopy, where she found a correlation between structure for motion percept duration, so reversal rate as such, and visual cortex scatter. At the same time as her, we were doing basically the same study, but we didn't find anything interesting at first, so it got sort of to the back of our publication queue. So when we finally got around to publishing, we thought we would make it as a Bayesian replication study, rather than just than presenting it as a new one, because some of the novelty was gone in that sense. So, but since you need a structural MRI to localize your spectroscopy voxels, so ours were positioned here in the occipital lobe. We have 2 voxels, large one covering most of the medial part of the occipital lobe, and then a small one here that's marked in red that covers just most of the calcarean sulcus, so P1 like. So you need a structural scan to position these. So we could at the same time replicate the original Kanai studies as well. We had 30-something participants, 35, 36, I don't quite remember. In these, which were substantially more than the previous CAPA study, and around half the previous BBM. So to do a small ROI replication study, we were better powered than both of the others. So the way that we did this is that we used the original study to make a Bayesian prior here, and that the shape and position of that prior is based on the correlation strength and the number of participants. Then when we add our new data to this, you can see that the posterior distribution, the new best guess, is shifted. For our large occipital voxel, we had a lot of participants, and it shifted very close to 0, with the probability of 0 correlation being much more likely after our data was collected than before, which means like a base factor, a very small base factor. So around, if you turn it around for the null, it would be a base factor of around 12, which is quite substantial evidence against the original finding. For the small occipital voxel, we had fewer participants, but also the correlation was somewhat higher. So the posterior was only moved slightly. So in this case, the conclusion is that the effect is smaller than originally thought. In the other case here, it's much smaller, maybe non-existent. So that was the results for GABA. If we move to gray matter volume, you have something similar, that the posterior is shifted towards smaller effect sizes for two of them, except one of them where it's actually spot on the earlier result, in which case the distribution just gets sharper, the estimate narrower, and you have a very high base factor of 41. But base factors alone can be a bit difficult to interpret, so it is, in general, I think, better interpreting the shape of the posterior distribution position of it. So we also did a different kind of analysis because we find it unrealistic that a single relatively broad neural characteristic, like the ones we're examining here, can explain all the variance in a complex phenomenon like bistable perception. And indeed, you can see that the updated effect sizes are around 0.4 in all cases, which means that moderate effect sizes alone, they explain 10 to 20% of the variability. So we wanted to examine them in a multivariate model to see if that performs better than the univariate models and how much variance we explain. So we did that and found that two predictors were the best, and in some of our models it was 3. And in either case, they explained around 30% of the variance. So using just these two relatively simple neuroarchitectural features, we can explain almost 1/3 of the inter-individual differences in this bistable perception phenomenon in terms of the alternation dynamics. Now we moved on then to visual illusions in another spectroscopy study. This was published with Chen Song, myself as the first authors, and Journal of Neuroscience. And we wanted to examine the influence of surround modulation on visual illusions, and that somewhat indirectly, but since it's GABA spectroscopy, GABA is the inhibitory neurotransmitter, we thought that would be a reasonably good index. And now the parietal cortex has these maps of size, where different size representation inhibit each other horizontally. And similarly, we have orientation representation in the occipital cortex. So we hypothesized that illusions of size would be related to parietal GABA and illusion of orientation to occipital GABA. And with the results, so this is the size illusion that we used, it's the Ebbinghaus illusion, where this disk here is the same size as this, but the one on the right should appear bigger. That's the illusion, at least. But exactly how much bigger it appears varies from person to person. And this illusion magnitude, we found them was related to parietal GABA concentration, but not the occipital. And correspondingly, we found that the occipital was related to orientation illusion magnitude, but not the parietal. And the illusion here is that these lines should appear more vertical than the ones over here, even though they have the same physical rotation. So, summarizing on this part, we have GABA and gray matter volume explain around 30% of the individual differences in structure for motion alternation rates, but the effects are smaller than previous studies indicate, and occipital parietal GABA explains around 20% of these two illusions I just presented. But what is common to both of these is that there seems to be much potential in examining more of these neuroarchitectural characteristics, both because we haven't explained the phenomena at all fully yet, but also because there are very few studies in this respect. So I will just talk about that for a couple of minutes as the final wrap up and as kind of a very brief introduction to the direction we're going in now. It will just be very brief because talking about the consortium that we set up to examine this is basically a whole talk in itself. But what we want to do is examine these neuroarchitectural characteristics. And the question then is, of course, how many aspects can we examine with the MRI and how long does it take? So what we're doing at the moment is that we combine just 3 different sequences. So this is a quantitative multi-parameter mapping. It is in some ways similar to a T1. You can generate a synthetic T1 from the sequence, but you can also get something more out of it, for instance, myelination estimates and other things as well. So you can get all the classic ones where you can do tissue segmentation, gray matter, white matter volume, and more things. And you can do segmentation of cortex into different areas, judge cortical curvature, thickness, size of these areas, all these types of things that you can do as well with the T1. We then have a resting state fMRI that allows us to get a functional connectivity matrix. But in addition to that, there are also, Chen Song is doing some development on methods to allow it to estimate lateral connectivity, which can be quite difficult with the next method that we have, which is diffusion MRI, and other methods indeed as well, because it's these small unmyelinated connections. So in diffusion MRI, that is really a sequence that can be used for many things. So you can get those classic tensor models, so DTI metrics out of it. They can be hard to interpret, but relate to microstructure in some way. You can also have more advanced methods and do get kurtosis metrics out. So they say something more about tissue microstructure, but again requires some interpretation. Then finally, you can use it for tractography, and you can get these structural connectivity maps as one thing, but you can also examine more specific things, and you can even combine the diffusion maps and the MPM maps to examine various characteristics of these fiber tracts. So the degree of myelination, and you can try to estimate conductivity speed and all kinds of things. So another clever thing about this is that all these scans you do while the participant is doing nothing. So you relate it to behavior that is done outside the scanner. So there's nothing preventing you from doing 10 hours of behavior and relating it to these extensive neuroarchitectural maps that have maybe 30 types of estimates in themselves. So that sounds like a lot of statistical comparisons, which is indeed the biggest problem. Is that practically feasible, financially feasible to get the statistical power needed for that? And it turns out that it actually is, and it's far less expensive than we thought it would be. So when you do one whole brain comparison study like this, you correct not with one-for-only corrections for every single voxel, but instead you typically correct for the expected number of false positives. And when you do that, you often need around 150 participants. So you're around here on this curve. So this is a plot of how many comparisons, or rather the sample size you can do that you need to conduct a certain number of comparisons for moderate effects. I think this is correlations of 0.35, while retaining a power of 80%. You can see if you want to do just one correlation, you need around 50-60 participants, but then to do the level of round whole brain correction is around here. somewhere between 100 and 1,000 comparisons, you need 150 participants. If you then say you want to do 30 behavioral studies, 30 types of neuroarchitectural features, you need 1,000 times as many comparisons. You actually only need to double the sample size to get to that. So that's basically the direction we're going in now, where we can then examine like build brain models of all these types of consciousness-related phenomena in relatively large sample of participants. So just to summarize the talk in general, and then I can take final questions if there are any. First part is that it's okay to use these objective measures when studying consciousness, but be careful what you conclude. Second part is that we find that there is no strong behavioral evidence that consciousness is all or none, and it's indeed our interpretation that it's the other way around. And the third part is that our studies at least do not provide support for a role of late prefrontal activity in conscious experience, but if anything, provides evidence for the opposite. Fourth part is that we can explain 20 to 30% of the variability in various aspects of conscious experience using only a few neuroarchitectural characteristics, and the future direction that we want to move in, particularly this last aspect here is this comprehensive neuroarchitectural mapping. So thank you very much for is there any questions at this point?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kristian. So yeah, we can have a discussion now. So anyone from Zoom, or I don't see any questions on Slido. So maybe someone has a question, then directly ask question now. Of course, we always have our delays when we finish the talk. So, okay.
We have someone coming on an image.
Oh yeah, Martin.
So it's maybe a bit difficult, but in this investigation of whether the awareness is graded, so as if I understand correctly, what you do is you check. Oh wait, I wrote something down somewhere. Maybe I should look at it. I wanted to ask this on Slido, but actually the Slido question character limit is very low, so you cannot ask longer questions.
Okay, but go ahead and take your time.
Give me a second. Oh, wrong one. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So you say you got this probability that the subjects thought that the top line was kind of longer in this example with this triangle.
Yeah.
But this probability, when you get this probability by, I guess, counting how many times you count you count events where the participant says the top line is longer.
Yeah. So they are basically on each trial, they are forced to choose which one was longer.
They are forced to choose. Okay, so they cannot, for example, they cannot say, I don't know.
I think in this particular design, no.
Okay, and
I don't remember if we did that in some of the pilots. So they have to choose.
Okay, and then you also asked them if they were. You also asked them how aware they were on this scale of 1 to 4.
Yeah.
I guess if I could. Okay, and yeah, so I guess the thing is, okay, so then you forced them. Yeah, because I think, I mean, it seems to me very, very difficult, because you could, I guess I could always say, yeah, in the individual event, either the subject was aware or not. And when you ask this question about how aware they were, then that's, yeah, I mean, like basically, if awareness is not graded, then they will just say something. I mean, how,
Yeah, indeed. And then you have the that then you could interpret it as saying that when they say weak experiences, it's actually a composition of mostly no experiences and then some full. You could say that, yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's that's the kind of, or like, yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, I'm actually wondering if there's any way to decide such a question, like in this.
Yeah, and I think for what we would typically say against this objection is that participants prefer to rate it gradedly, and and that we have these, that the accuracy levels in other tasks also correspond to these graded levels. But I agree with you that it's not, that we're still not there 100%, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how we can probe this the best. It's very difficult, I think, to prove that experience is graded, but we've also mostly.
Like I'm actually wondering if you could prove that, if there is the, like in general, if you want to prove that something is great, some quantity is actually graded and not, or like continuous and not binary. There's like some, is there, how do we prove this in general?
Yeah, indeed. But I think for other types of questions that are not so important to theories, people are willing to accept gradedness much easier. I don't think you need a lot of
yeah, I mean, I think awareness is like, I think I think that's quite difficult, and also like lots of people are invested in this, I guess.
Yeah, and we're stuck in an infinite loop, because the easiest thing would say, well, then we just look at the neural correlates of consciousness and we check if that's graded or not. And then we look at the brain and we have these components. We have one that is graded and one that is not, and then we can just keep discussing. Because that didn't help us.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah. That was mostly my question. I mean, did you say that you, like, I think you said something about you derived this awareness scale in some way?
Yeah, it's made by participants themselves. So you just present stimuli to them and say, make a scale that you prefer to use to report your experience of these things.
So they can they also choose a binary one?
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with them just picking 2 steps on a scale. Okay. It turns out, so the original study by my old supervisor didn't have a lot of participants in it. So the fact that no one chose 2 steps, I think in that one, basically everyone chose 4 steps, but everyone was not that many. It's like 6 people, I don't know. So it's not that surprising that you get that people seem to agree in such a small sample. But when we did the motor control scale, we had 30 something, which seems like a better number. And there we see the variance, but again, we didn't actually see anyone preferring just 2 steps. But I'm sure if you go up to 200 or 300, you get 1 or 2 or 3 who say, no, we see it sometimes when people come in to do experiments.
Okay.
That there are some people who just use the lowest and the highest. Some even say, like when we're explaining the task to them, they're saying, yeah, well then I either see it or I don't, right? And it's like, well, that's up to you to decide. But they say it in advance of the studies. And it's like,
Yeah,
okay,
but I
so
think
then
that, I think this shows that people just don't understand. When you ask them to create a scale, they already rule out basically that it's a binary thing. I mean, they kind of think
that
if I
might be.
say, because they're like mathematically.
But then that
trained.
sounds like an experiment. You can easily just say, and it's completely fine if your scale only has 2 steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most people will, if you say make your own scale, they will actually just not even think about the possibility that they could just make a scale.
It's possible. Personally, I don't think so, but it's possible.
I would think if somebody makes this experiment,
but it's not the hardest experiment in the world. To just add that description in there.
It's easier than your other experiments.
Yes.
Much easier, I think.
Yeah. Maybe related to this, like, is there any like kind of intervention study like on the hospital cortex and see the like subjective rating different changes after some TMS?
Yeah, so how it influences awareness, for
Right.
example, TMS or something, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are some different studies on that, and they definitely show that there's an effect, but to some degree, the problem also is that performance is affected, and so that means that, of course, if objective performance is affected, then you don't know if you're just disrupting visual processing as such, or you're disrupting awareness selectively.
Right.
So, yeah, so the people who've been doing studies like that are Juha Silvanto and Mika Koivisto have done some. And there are also prefrontal studies. But to be honest, I think we could use more TMS studies with larger sample sizes. Many of the ones that have been there, the effects have been just at the threshold of significance. So you're kind of wondering, okay, what would it have looked like if the sample size was 2 or 3 times as big?
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe the other wants to ask.
Thank you for the talk. I just had like kind of like generic comment / question. So in a way, some of your experiments were about testing theories. So for example, I think whether consciousness or experience is all or none is related to the conception of the global workspace theory type of idea, but it's kind of currently inconclusive according to your results. But a lot of things I saw today kind of things we have been like doing for many years now. But I wonder whether we can more directly test existing theories of consciousness. For example, it's probably very difficult to directly test something like integrated information theory, but probably you're aware of this All-Important World Charity Foundation's support for adversarial collaboration to distinguish different theories. So, and then towards the end, you also presented future directions related to sort of collecting multimodal neuroimaging data. So I wonder like whether you considered how we can actually test particularly computational.
Indeed, kind of. I think that's something on all of our minds frequently. And to me, part of the issue is that many of the theories are worded kind of conceptually. So we're trying to test conceptual theories empirically. And whenever, so if you go 10 years back or 15 years back, many of the things we have then done in the years after would have probably been considered enough to disprove a theory. But then it actually turns out that you can just do a slight modification. So if you prove that conscious experiences are predicted from posterior cortex activity to a much larger degree than frontal, you'd think that goes against the theory that says it has to be in the frontal cortex, otherwise it doesn't do anything. As long as it's in the occipital, it can go one way or the other. Then you'd expect from that conceptual statement that the occipital cortex should not be the most predictive. It should be predictive to some extent, but the frontal should be so more so. But then it turns out that when we actually do the studies, you can just modify it by saying, well, maybe we don't have a clear enough signal from the frontal cortex, or maybe the signal that's in the frontal cortex is so small that that it doesn't show up much. But that's the key signal. We just can't localize it yet. So part of the solution, I think, is good in these adversarial collaborations, because then people commit to a statement that can actually falsify their theory, rather than having other people come up with a way that they think could falsify it. But then once they do what they think is falsifying it, the theory just gets modified slightly, and then it's still in the game. So that's one way. The other way is that I think a lot of other fields, and consciousness is definitely doing it as well, is moving in the direction of model comparisons. So what I'd like is for the people to commit to certain model characteristics or features that can be tested much more directly in the data. So where you basically just mathematically show evidence for one model versus another model or model family. I think that's another way to go. Personally, I also hope that the direction we're going in with the neuroarchitectural features is important, because part of the issue have been report confounds. And so people are now discussing no report paradigms and what is the validity of those. Do they change everything? Like, do they change the experiences? Do they change attention, the tasks? And for us, I think it's when we're doing behavior and brain scan completely separately, we don't really have the report problem. We don't have report related activity in these types of paradigms. So if we can build a model of all the dynamics of any of these phenomena, essentially without the prefrontal cortex, then again, I'd say that's pointing towards the role of the posterior cortex, but then again, I'm not sure it would convince everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. So, yeah, actually, like already we spent almost 2 hours. So we can maybe close the YouTube, but we can have a small chat. I have a I want to ask some stuff on the ScoutNet. So
yeah.
So let's see. Oh yeah, there's one question, like which consciousness theories your study support? Like recurrent processing. Sorry, like I'll share this one question from anonymous person.
Yeah. I see it here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way we've interpreted them is to basically mostly go against global neuronal workspace theory. But the question is then what they support is, I don't really know. I mean, probably some aspects of recurrent processing. But then again, I think the theory there is also in some aspects a little bit unclear, so you don't know exactly what.
Sure.
You don't have exactly clear models in every case, and I do believe that. So when I've talked to Victor Lamy, he has mentioned that he also believes in this all or none consciousness. So even in the recurrent processing theory, that's apparently, or at least one version of it, that's apparently an aspect, and personally not one that I think our data supports.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So I think, yeah, you answered all the questions. So yeah, let me close the talk. But before that, let me advertise a little bit and next talk from the next month. So yeah, we're going to have our speaker from the Minbo Tai, project assistant professor from University of Tokyo. So yeah, please check out the next Consciousness Club talk too. All right. So yeah, thank you very much, Kristian. And so yeah, we're going to finish this talk on YouTube. Okay, thank you very much for the YouTube.
Thank you for dropping by.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kristian.
Yeah.